You read about this work in last night's homework, and I talked about it in my previous podcast. It is not a College Board required work, but it is a very important transitional work in this course because we see the notion of kingship in Mesopotamia undergoing a significant shift. The Akkadian king has godlike qualities, and his close association with the gods is reinforced by the horns he wears, a symbol of the gods, and the stars or suns that shine down on him, indicating that he has the favor of heavens. We also see our old friend's hierarchical scale and naked, beaten enemies. But before we finish up our forced march through 2,000 years of Mesopotamian history and art, let me note that certain symbols of rule show up time and again, and not only in the art of this culture. We have talked before about the significance of bulls. The figure on the right is on the left is Sumerian, part of a lyre or musical instrument. The lion from Babylon's Ishtar Gate is also associated with kingly power. After the Akkadians were conquered by a mountain tribe, the city-states of Sumer enjoyed a temporary resurgence, and then were conquered and unified by one of these city-states, Babylon. Just to make matters confusing, there is another Babylonian empire about 1,000 years later, and that's in fact the one that erected the Ishtar Gate that you just saw. The first Babylon is more important for our purposes because this culture produced one of the most important works, not only of art, but of historical record, the Stele of Hammurabi. I am not going to repeat all the information from the Khan Academy video, so let's hear from you instead. How does this stele reinforce the power and authority of the king? Well, he's hanging out with the sun god. Shamash is willing to admit Hammurabi into his godly presence. And while Hammurabi raises and crosses his hand in a show of respect for the god, and while Hammurabi stands while the god sits, we still see that Hammurabi is not portrayed as much smaller than the god himself. Not the kind of size difference we saw, for example, between King Narmer and his officials, or between Naram Sin and his soldiers. So what is the god handing to Hammurabi? He's handing Hammurabi a rod or scepter and a ring. These are traditional symbols of rule, but they are also connected to the idea that Hammurabi is building a kingdom by promulgating laws. The rod was used in building as a unit of measurement, and the ring signifies a rope, also used in construction. So in essence, the god is handing over the power to build a social order and to measure people's lives, that is, to render judgment. Here's a good vocabulary word to know. The stele represents Hammurabi's investiture. American presidents have an inauguration when they take an oath of office and become president. Here, Hammurabi is taking his oath directly from the god. The stele, of course, lists Hammurabi's famous and rather harsh laws. You saw a few of those in your reading, including the famous an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But note that the law, as well as the favor of the gods, is seen as a sign of Hammurabi's power and an indication of his right to rule. He is the king who imposes and enforces order. So, we've talked about hieratic scale. What other stylistic devices or conventions can you observe in this work? So earlier I talked about foreshortening, creating an illusion of depth by showing some body part at an angle as if it was jutting out toward us. This work displays a somewhat awkward early version of foreshortening, but clearly the artist is trying to create an illusion of more depth with the angle of the arms, the overlapping of the arms, and the diagonal lines of the beard. Again, typical of Near Eastern art, we see the head in profile, but with a frontal eye. Yet note that while the eye is frontal, the horns are not. They are shown in true profile, unlike the horns on Naram Sin. We also see the lower body in profile with the feet marching in the same direction, yet the upper body squared. And the name for this kind of portrayal, again, is composite perspective. You recall the Assyrians, right? Those were the vicious invaders we encountered in the story of Judith and Holofernes. And indeed, they feature regularly as bad guys in the Old Testament. As you see from this map, at its height, Assyria ruled large swaths of the Near East and Egypt as well. Wealth poured into the empire from conquered peoples, and the Assyrians used this wealth to create commanding palaces designed to portray the glory of the king, the blessing of the chief god Ashur, and the havoc that Assyria would wreak on anyone who chose to oppose them. The relief images from the palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh are not on the required works list, but the Lamassu, the guardian beast that guarded the entrance to every Assyrian palace, are. So I want to use these relief sculptures and a video that talks about them to set the stage for the Lamassu. This is an excellent example of how a ruler used art, and especially narrative art, to reinforce his power and his claim to rule. The beginning of the video explains that Ashurbanipal was deliberately imitating the ancient story of Gilgamesh, the legendary Sumerian king who features in the first great work of narrative and religious literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. As you'll probably guess, Gilgamesh proved his strength by fighting a lion. So you saw the Lamassu in the computer recreation of Ashurbanipal's palace. This king and palace come 100 years or so earlier, but they do come from the same culture. By the way, the College Board labels this work as Neo-Assyrian because there were earlier Assyrian empires. But this was the empire that features in the Bible and most prominently in the history books, and it's the only Assyrian culture that shows up in the AP list of required works. As we've seen, Assyrian rulers deliberately constructed their cities and palaces to showcase and reinforce their power and grandeur. The city would have included a vast complex of buildings, including several ziggurats topped with temples. So what's that circled building? It's a ziggurat. These guardian figures, or Lamassu, guarded the gate to the Assyrian king's palace. The Lamassu combined the bearded head of a man with the body of a lion or bull, the wings of an eagle, and the horned headdress of a god. So, how does this work convey power and authority? And how do stylistic conventions, again, that's form in our big four, reinforce the sense of power and authority? Well, notice the face of Sargon and the face of the Lamassu. The guardian figure's head is the king's head. We are seeing the king as a god. The figure is huge, a monstrous guardian. The size itself is intended to provoke awe. The human head is affixed to the body of a powerful beast, a lion or a bull, symbolizing the king's superhuman strength. Both animals are associated with kingship, power, and virility in ancient Near Eastern, and for that matter, other cultures. The 5 legs allow us to see the features of the Lamassu from a frontal view and from a profile view. This creates an impression that the animal is walking toward whomever enters the gates, and then alongside anyone who has gained entry. There is no getting away from this watchful figure. Anyone approaching the king's throne room will have to deal with the Lamassu. The fearsome claws underscore the ferocity of Assyrian kings, and indeed, they earned that reputation. Check out your Old Testament. Although the Assyrians briefly conquered Egypt, as did a few other invaders, for the most part Egypt remained a remarkably stable empire for 15 centuries, and it is to this stable, even static world that we now turn.